Hey you, and welcome. My name is Mike, and in this old video, we are setting sail in the summer of 1816. Roughly 150 of the people who survived the shipwreck of the Medusa, they were kind of put aboard this little raft. And here's a little sneak preview. It kind of looked like this. I drew that. So, applause. 147 people were on that. Less than 2 weeks later, only 15 of those 147 people would still be alive. So yeah, that's the story we're talking about today. Now let's start talking about it. Let's give it a go. So in the June of 1816, 4 ships left France as part of a convoy, and they were sailing to Senegal. The Medusa was a fine ship. In my professional opinion, it was pretty good. It was a well-renowned ship. It was good. It was modern. It was up to date. It was a ship. Like, it's great. I don't know what else to tell you. Given command of the Medusa was a guy named, and I actually have to read this because his name is crazy, Hugh du Roy de Chaumareix. Hugh was an interesting guy. Probably not someone who should have been given command of a ship like this at all, mainly because he hadn't actually sailed in 25 years by the time 1816 rolled around to see. Hugh, he was given command of the Medusa because essentially he was connected to the newly restored monarchy. He was a good old boy, and so he had friends, and they were like, here you go. Last time he had sailed was during the American Revolution on a French ship in the Americas at that time. He'd sailed during then during the French Revolution, which followed swiftly afterwards, he fled to England, lest he, be guillotined and killed. Then he came back to France when the monarchy was restored, and essentially he kind of just lied his way into being command of this ship. And they were like, all right, here you go. And he said, so he was given command of the Medusa, which was to be part of this expedition. These 4 ships, they were going to travel from France to Senegal, to the port of Saint-Louis in Senegal, as France was taking back control of the colony there. And so let's begin the voyage, which began on June 17th, 1816. The Medusa, newly repainted black and white, it had 30 of its cannons removed, so it could make way for more provisions and more soldiers and supplies it was taking to the colony of Senegal. The French, they were kind of eager little beavers to get in there. They were giving grants to French people to move to Senegal, and they were given loads of land. On board, as Captain Hugh, obviously, who was in command of the whole thing, there was also the new governor of Senegal who was going there. Governor Schmaltz was his name, and there's a couple of other bigwigs on board. 4 ships were heading out of this convoy: the Medusa, the Loire, the Argus, and the Echo. The Medusa being the flagship. On board the Medusa were approximately 400 people, 3/4 of those soldiers or sailors, the rest passengers, explorers, families, engineers, naturalists, tradespeople, administrators. Things were in good shape, though, once it headed out. The crew were getting on really well together. They were working really well all together. One incident, though, they did have was a 15-year-old sailor went overboard, and they failed to rescue him. In fact, Captain Hugh would come under a lot of criticism for that, because they thought he acted very, very slowly before the boy went down to Davy Jones' locker. Yes, the Captain Hugh generally wasn't well regarded by the crew. They thought him inadequate, inept, and arrogant. All of which were true. I mean, he hadn't sailed for 25 years. He knew he shouldn't have been command of this and didn't have a clue what he was doing, but he was hiding it off with a little bit of gold arrogance. So anytime somebody on the Medusa tried to challenge him, he would be like, listen here, pal, etc., etc. They continued to sail south past Spain and Portugal, reaching the islands of Tenerife. But the convoy became split up. Some of the other ships in the convoy, they couldn't keep up with the Medusa. And now a convoy kind of splitting up is not unusual. It's actually fairly common. They're like, we all know where we're going. We'll see at some point, along the way. We might lose you for a few days, but we'll get you a spyglass and there you scrat. But the Medusa's navigational charts were off. They were not exactly heading in the right direction, and 1 degree can be catastrophic. It can take you way away from where you need to be. And other officers and crew on the Medusa started to realize this, that they were getting closer and closer. Like, they're supposed to go around the coast of Africa, but they were getting closer and closer to Africa itself. So they knew this was going on, but Hugh and his navigator was a little crony of his. Boy, oh boy, you better not criticize them or else. This truly is a story, one that is all too common of, just incompetence and arrogance, which are always a great mix, leading to horrific circumstances for everybody involved. And so, as they approached Senegal, other officers knew they were way off course, and dangerously so. The Arguin Bank was well known at this point. It's a shallow water area, full of sandbanks and whatnot. Great for fishing, terrible for big hefty ships that need a lot of depth, so they don't run aground. And officers could see they were getting close to the bank. Kelp and seaweed were becoming more visible. The water, it changed color from blue to green. They could see more and more fish. They sailed, and the water was constantly getting shallower and shallower until Hugh finally said, okay, change direction. Quarter, starboard, something, whatever. By that time, though, it was too little and it was too late. And on July 2nd, there was a scraping sound, there was a lurching, there was a jolting, and the Medusa ran into a sandbank and became stuck. 50 kilometers, 30 miles off the coast of Mauritania, just north of Senegal. It had become lodged on these sandbanks that were just underneath the water. Now, when it initially happened, obviously it was shocking, everybody was kind of freaking out, but they didn't realize they were as screwed as they actually were. The captain, Hugh, by the way, he immediately, when this happened and he realized, oh, this is my fault, he immediately just went pale, he went quiet, and he became pretty much completely useless for kind of the rest of this story, actually. They checked how deep the water was below the Medusa. It was 5 meters, which is about 16 feet. This was at high tide. The water was only going to get shallower and shallower. They could not move the ship. Some now suggested, how about we start throwing stuff overboard? How about we start getting rid of some of the cannons and some of the provisions and supplies we were taking to the colony? And they were immediately said, no. We would rather lose everything than lose some of the supplies we're bringing to the colony. Hugh, Captain Hugh, he was more or less told, be quiet and stand in the corner, while Governor Schmaltz, he took charge of this entire situation. So, moving the ship initially seemed impossible. Throwing stuff overboard to try and lighten the load so the ship might be able to kind of slip off the sandbank, that was poo-pooed. That idea was poo-pooed. The next idea, alright, how about we get everybody off the Medusa? They did have a couple of longboats, but they were pretty meant people who were on board. Nowhere near enough. It would have taken days to ferry everybody on the ship to land, which was again like 30 miles away. It would have taken days to do it all. And they were worried that, well, for start, land is desert out there, and they were worried about attacks and enslavement by the Moors who lived there at the time. Or their next thing was, how about we just send one of these smaller little longboats and we sail to Saint Louis, and then we just wait till we get help. But the problem with that was that they were worried the Medusa could start breaking apart at any time, and then they would really be screwed. Or, how about this? They could create a giant raft capable of carrying a lot of people and supplies and provisions, and then with those smaller boats, they tow the raft to land, and then everybody gets off, and then they just walk from there to Senegal. But at least they get everybody off at the same time, so there's no kind of, 5 boats towed, they'd be there, at least they'd all be together. That was Governor Schmaltz's idea. Guess which idea they went with? And so, construction of the raft began, which they called the Machine. Or, as they say in French, La Machine! See, the reason they wanted to get out of there as soon as possible was that the seas were getting rougher and rougher, the wind was constantly picking up, and they were waiting for late summer storms, so they were really thinking things are going to get no bomb. So, carpenters, they got to work. They used booms, and they used masts, they used planks, they held it all together with wood, they took apart basically as much as they could to make this big raft. It was as shite as you think it might be. So, as you can see, this is what it would have looked like, and it kind of looks like, there's planks, and it was all tied together with rope, and as you can see, it kind of looks like a big waffle. Now, you can probably tell, understand what the problem with setting it a big waffle out to the open ocean would be. And your problem right there is that it will get wet. It won't be delicious and crispy anymore. There was a railing about 40 centimeters high, about 1 foot high, around the entire thing, so you won't fall off. It's a good whole foot high. And a lot of it was actually underwater already. So it looked like this, or it looked like this. I prefer my one though, because this one was made with love. So you have a recipe for disaster already, and the raft hasn't even set out yet. It'll get worse. So it would be towed to the coast by 5 boats. So that's kind of what it would have looked like, something like that. That's not poop, they're actually boats. So take them to land, then walk over. And people were either assigned to the boats or to the raft itself. This would eventually fit 147 people on this, while the rest would go on these long boats. All the important people, the governor, his family, captains, officers, they all were on the boats. They made damn sure they were not going to be on the raft. Not their cup of tea being on board this thing, which is about as good as it looks. As you can see, surrounded by water and by sharks. And so on July 5th, the evacuation order was given. Now listen up, Hotshot. Have you ever Googled yourself and were like, hold on, compadre? There's a little too much about me online. It's not entirely cool like the cucumber allegedly is. Well, guess what? You are not alone. Every week it seems we hear about leaks and hacks and records being exposed on the internet. And with so much of our daily lives being online these old days, protecting your identity is more important than ever. That's where Aura comes in. Aura, big dogs, is an app designed to keep you safe online, preventing identity theft. Aura protects you from scammers and hackers by scanning the deep web, the dark web, the web on that shelf you don't want anyone to look at. In all the places your private information can be sold. Scammers and those darn dirty hackers sell your emails, your passwords, your social security number, your shoes. Aura has a guru around the internet, looks for your information, scanning, and it gives you a heads up if it finds it. And honestly, it probably will. It's happened to me. I've been recommended to change many of my passwords, which I've done, haven't I? Also, you ever get annoying emails, scammer emails from company and folk you never heard of? Well, somewhere along the way, nefarious people got your information and they just sold it on. Can you believe it? Aura will automatically request removals of your details. And it also has a whole host of other features. I'm talking VPN, real-time alerts of suspicious credit inquiries, malware and virus detection, and password managers. Does it all, frankly. Let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online. And if you sign up right now using my special link, aura.com/thatchapter, Aura will not only give you an exclusive offer and a hell of a discount, they will also give you a 2-week free trial to experience their incredible service for yourself. And it's got a hell of a high rating, so you know they'll take good care of your booty. Once again, go to aura.com/thatchapter, try out their 2-week free trial, and if you like it, you can get an incredible exclusive deal using my little link. Try today, and honestly be horrified by how much of your private information is out there. But Aura is giving you the aura of protection, which is a nice little smooch, virtually. Now, let's get back to it. When they were evacuating and people started boarding the raft, by the time 40 men were aboard, it had already sank 2 feet into the water. Parts of it were pretty heavily underwater before a third of the people were even aboard the goddamn thing. Provisions were thrown off the raft to try and lighten the load so it would be able to hold these people without sinking entirely. So then by the end of it, they would have 6 tubs of wine, 6 tubs of wine, 2 tubs of water, and a bag of soggy seawater soaked biscuits. That was all for 147 people. And another 100 people still had to get on board the raft that was already sinking because it was shite. Most of the people who actually ended up getting on the raft were forced to. At musket point, all the officers said, yeah, I'm not setting foot on that. In fact, one of the lieutenants who was supposed to be in charge of the raft, he even said it was the plan for him to go onto the raft and he'll take care of them all. He said, 17 people stayed back on the Medusa rather than get on board this raft. So they set out, the raft pulled by 4 boats, actually one turned out wasn't big enough to actually do anything, and they were headed towards land. But I mean, yeah, okay, they can make it, right? Not too far. Things will be triple. Then shit happened because the current was pulling the raft out to sea. The raft was much bigger than the boats that were towing it. So the raft was being pulled by the current away from land. and the raft was pulling the towboats with it away from land. So no bon over here at all. Je ne pas no bon. And so the order was given. Cut the ropes. Now some protested. They said don't cut them. But the governor gave the order, and what the governor says, that gets done. Au revoir. And so with hatchets, the ropes were cut. The boats were now free to make their way to dry land, while the raft was drifting further and further away from the towboats, away from land, the current just dragging it slowly out to sea, while the 147 people aboard were screaming
I told you we'd have
not to be abandoned. Land was nowhere in sight, and they had absolutely no way to steer them. So this is when the fun begins. Now the raft was shite. As I said, much of it was underwater. A lot of people who were on the raft, they were underwater up to their waists, trying to just touch the bottom of the raft itself with their feet. There was waves constantly knocking against people, saltwater spray. Some people had to tie ropes around themselves lest they be dragged off by the water that was simply washing over the top of the raft. The hot African sun was beating down, and there ain't no shade. There was no shade or cover on the raft either. That was out in the middle of the ocean. A guy named Henri Sauvigny, he was the ship's surgeon, and he was the one to take command. He took over and tried to start, okay, this is what we need to do. There wasn't really much he can do. He supervised the construction of a small sail, and he was going to gate out the first meal, the first and only meal that was which they would ever get, which was soggy, seawater-soaked biscuits dipped in wine. After that, the food was gone. They didn't have charts, they didn't pack a compass. One guy on board the raft just so did happen to have a compass, but when he took it out of his pocket, he dropped it, and it fell between the planks of the raft and down into the water below. And madness didn't take long to set in for these people. Some people, they just jumped off the raft. They simply just floated off, letting the sea take them, thinking that it'd be better to go this way than to try and survive on the raft and live out agonizing days here waiting to die. People, of course, who would be floating off, or who walked off or jumped off the raft, were promptly eaten by sharks that were circling the raft too. The raft, as I said, not well built, so the planks that were held together rope, they began to separate, which was the ground for them. People would get their limbs trapped in the planks below, or their waists, or whatever, either dragging you down and then drowning you under the water, or breaking limbs and breaking legs and breaking anything that got caught between them. And so darkness slowly began to fall. Pitch black darkness floating in the water. Most people barely able to touch the bottom of the raft with their feet floating in the water, just trying to cling tightly to one another as waves would keep crashing in against them as the weather got worse and worse. The first night, 20 people died. People began to lose their minds, to hallucinate, to cry out in fear, and then the weather became stormy, with these waves crashing against the raft. The wind was picking up, swells would wash over and drag people off the raft, dragging them to their doom where they would never be seen again. People were constantly trying to get to the middle of the raft, where it was safest and where it was highest above the water, which meant getting there any way you can, dragging people out of your way. There's people crushed and people trampled to death. They'd be reefing people out of the way, who then would be washed away by a wave that would just come over and wash people off the raft. One group of soldiers, they went crazy. They stole one of the barrels of wine, which was now mixed with salt water, and they drank it all, and they got drunk like in 2 seconds. They were already losing their minds, and so they took out some of their weapons and they started breaking the raft apart with hatchets and with swords and killing anybody who approached them. They grabbed their own officer, who they evidently had some kind of problem with, dragged him to them and gouged his eyes out. They then had to be killed by the others, and it was like these miniature battles aboard this big, huge raft with, these soldiers who'd gone insane, and then these other people who were trying to keep things in order, and then they were killing each other and stabbing, and people were throwing each other overboard to get to safety. Soon the raft was covered with dead and wet bodies. By the third day, another 60 people had died. The raft had only been out for 3 days now, and over half the people who had been on it were dead, and only 1 cask of wine remained for 70. The 70 remaining people. This is literally hell aboard this raft. Some then, out of hunger, began eating leather pouches. One tried to eat his own shit, but he couldn't go through with it. And of course everything was covered in salt water, which just made their hunger and their thirst more insatiable and insane. And so, with dead bodies littering the raft, you can kind of see where this is going. You gotta wonder how far you can push to become a cannibal. Pretty far, I guess. I think this qualifies. The custom of the sea is, as it's called, you know, it's basically sailors' way of saying if you're trapped out on the sea, cannibalism, you get a pass for cannibalism in that situation. And if no bodies are available, well, straws would be drawn, and, well, you know, in this case they had a lot of bodies already. So on the third day at water, people began hacking up the bodies and just going for them. They whipped out knives, they whipped out hatchets, they started slicing meat off these bodies, which littered the rats, slicing the meat off their shoulders or their legs, and just chowing down, munching in raw. But what happened, see? All the while the sea ravaged around them, and you know, they tried to sleep standing up because you obviously couldn't, most of them were up to water in their waists, so you couldn't exactly lie down. They were huddled together, and then night would fall. The next morning, there would be more bodies. By the fourth day, everybody was eating the dead, and after another night where another group of soldiers went insane and started murdering others on the raft, pretty soon there was only 30. Everyone was wounded or extremely ill at this point, and so tough decisions had to be made. Even tougher than the human meat they were eating. You can imagine what those were, right? Not everybody is going to survive this. We need to ration out the food we have, and a lot of people are dead, dying, wounded, fatally wounded. What's the point of giving them food if they're going to be dead in a couple of hours? Bit of a waste. The closest to death were put on half rations, which at this point was pretty much no rations at all, like maybe half a gulp of wine and a chomp of human for your day ration. But then Sauvigny and some of the other people, they began to realize even that's not going to be enough if the bulk of people are going to make it. More needed to be done to survive. Survival at this point was probably an extra few days. So they did it. Four soldiers went up, 2 people grabbed each limb. 1 and 2 and survive. One of the first people they threw off board was the only woman. Her husband. He went overboard. The leader of the raft, Henry Sauvigny, by the way, he would survive the raft, and he would later write a book about his ordeal, and he said this was the hardest part of trying to live on the raft. But this is what he had to say about it. Readers who shudder at the cry of outraged humanity recollect, at least, that it was other men, fellow countrymen and comrades, who had placed us in this abominable situation. What we did was horrific, but you should really blame those who put us in this situation. I mean, those rich people, they kind of spiritually were the ones who actually threw them overboard. Then there was 15 people left on this raft, which was barely hanging together. Half of it was just floating off and barely attached by ropes that were rotting, wood that was rotting. The remaining people threw all the weapons overboard, so they wouldn't be able to kill each other, because they all started going insanely paranoid. And then they set about doing absolutely nothing, waiting for the inevitable, just lying there on the raft under the hot baking sun. They drank their own pee to survive. They would pee in their little canteens, put it in pools of seawater to cool it down. Glug glug. They said other people's pee tasted differently. There you go. Sharks that were still circling the raft, and everything that was painful was extremely painful. The sun was constantly beating down, so they would submerge themselves in water to try and cool their bodies down. But then a group, a whole load of Portuguese man-of-war jellyfish would wash on board, stinging the shite out of them. But I can imagine their pain was just so unbearable, they probably didn't even notice. They were there for a week, lying on the raft with no energy. Just lying there waiting to die, being burnt to the crisp, when early on the morning of July 17th, they finally saw sail. It was the Argus, one of the ships that had set out with the convoy in the first place. To put it connily, they looked like shit when these 15 people were rescued. They were burnt all over, emaciated, and they were insane. Some of the survivors tried to immediately jump overboard back into the water when they were saved. And of the 15 people they did save, 5 would pass away within a couple of days. The Argus had lost sight of the Medusa when it had ran aground. It had been searching the area for like 2 weeks before it just so happened to stumble across the raft. They were then taken to St. Louis and given food, gently given food, and to tell their story of the 147 people who set out. 15 survived. Of those 15, only 10 survived. The rest had been eaten by humans or sharks, or murdered, or thrown overboard, or whatever. And Captain Hugh would get the blame for the entire ordeal. His incompetence was essentially the reason this had all happened, but of course, being the good old boy that he was, he just got a little slap on the wrist for it. He was court-martialed, but he only got 3 years in jail, in prison for it. I mean, he could have been executed for what had happened. Governor Schmaltz, he escaped all blame. He would stay in Senegal, do 4 years as governor. Even though it was his idea to build the raft and then cut the ropes, he still kind of scot-free. The Medusa was found. It was pretty broken open though by the time it was found. Of the 17 men who stayed with the Medusa, only 3 of them were still alive. 1 had just died the morning they were about to be rescued, and a lot of the others, they tried to swim to land, but they were never seen again. Of course though, when a ship came across the Medusa, I was like, yippee, they weren't there to look for any survivors. They were there for all the provisions it still had, of course. This entire incident was immortalized by French painter Theodore Géricault. He later read the story of the tragedy and became transfixed by it. He met with survivors, he interviewed them, and he even procured body parts from a nearby insane asylum, including a severed head, because he wanted to get the bodies in the painting just right. And Géricault actually painted it while being advised by some of these survivors. One even posed for the painting to make it as accurate as possible. The raft of the Medusa hangs in the Louvre today, showing the moment when the survivors spotted the Argus in the distance. The whole incident was very embarrassing for the French, of course, who had only recently just restored their own monarchy, and then through the incompetence of one of their captains, well, you had cannibalism and this whole rigmarole. Didn't look good for them. In fact, the British, who were handing over the colony to the French, treated the survivors of the Medusa way better than the French did. They gave them better food and they brought them back to France. I think the French government probably would have been just much more happy if nobody had survived and nobody had lived to tell the tale. And so ends the story of the Medusa and the wreck and the raft and the whole kind of kit and caboodle. A horror of survival for sure, when it's not really told much, or at least I knew very little of it, so I hope we learned something new today, kids. But definitely one thing I learned is how little it takes for absolute savagery to break out. Within 2 days, they were killing each other. Within 3, they were eating each other. Doesn't take much, just one small push for you to go overboard and then start doing things that are at one point unimaginable for you. But, you know, you gotta do what you gotta do. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you being here, watching this whole video. It means so much to me as always. I hope you found it interesting. Little piece of dark history, which, you know, I love to tell. I love history and I love horror, so it's great to mix them like in these kind of stories. So yeah, listen, here, check out the Patreon for Patreon exclusive videos and early access to all videos. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. I'm not on Telegram, so if you ever get any comments claiming to be me or Mike O or that chapter in YouTube videos or anywhere, if you ever get any comments saying, let's talk about this on Telegram or you've won a competition, it is not me. If I'm not on Telegram, full stop. And if I am ever having a competition or anything like that, you will hear the words from my very own mouth. There's about 1 million bots on YouTube pretending to be me and other creators. I deleted, I banned loads of them, but they still keep popping up, so just beware of that. But yeah. Anyways, I'll see you in the next old video. So listen, here, I'll see you real soon in the next old video, but until then, please, as always, take care of each other, take care of yourselves, because I love you. Mike out. Hey you, and welcome. My name is Mike, and in this old video, I have laryngitis. I had a chest infection for like the past week and I'm only just getting over it, which is why I sound like this. I sound kind of cool. I might actually try and keep this voice. In this old video, we're talking about the story of Mark Kilroy. He was a good kid, you know, he excelled in academia, he excelled in sports, and he had one of the bright futures like directly ahead of him. But we don't talk about bright futures on that chapter. We talk about dark pasts, and this has a hell of a lot of that. This is the ultimate vacation gone wrong, and no, he didn't lose his luggage, he didn't get food poisoning, he did not get pickpocketed. He went on a journey into hell, almost literally. This is the story of one of the most disturbing and disgusting groups imaginable. The stuff boogeymen and nightmares are made of. You know, you got boiling brains in a pot, weird sexual stuff, satanic black magic, sick shit. What started out as, you know, a happy ass trip, some dudes having fun on spring break, quickly became a hell break or something like that, but you know, sounds better than that. And then it became a manhunt for a sadistic madman who thought he was, and he was, an angel of death. I mean, his name was Adolfo, so let's give it a go. It all began when it was time to party, brother! After a semester of hitting the books and, eating shit, spring had arrived and summer was just around the corner. And Mark Kilroy and some of his pals, they had big plans for spring break. In 1989, Mark Kilroy was 21 years of age. A handsome, serious kid, serious but exciting and always up for a challenge and something new experiences. He and some of his closest friends had grown up together in the town of Santa Fe, which is like a distant suburb of Houston, where the chemicals, from the oil refineries are constant. In school, he was one of them, like all Americans. He was good at the books, he was good at the balls, he was in the Boy Scouts, he was an honor roll student. He was offered basketball scholarships, like the whole 9 yards. He graduated Santa Fe High School in 1986. He played baseball and he had played basketball, and then much to the delight of his parents, Jim and Helen, he then went to do a pre-med course at the University of Texas in Austin. He had dabbled in a couple of other universities before gathering the credits and the grades necessary, but now he seemed settled and focused on what laid ahead. Even turning down an offer from the Austin branch of his fraternity. He was like super serious about hitting the books. He was getting down to it. He didn't want to be out drinking and chasing girls. He was like, it's all about the studies. But he didn't forget what lay behind, and that was his best friends from Santa Fe, and they were the people he was going to party with for spring break. Even though they'd all gone their separate ways, they would stay in touch. They would meet up regularly when they were all back in town, and now they were planning this trip, which was something they did every year. And so, growing up in Texas, and now it's spring break at the University of Texas, it was time to hit the road for Padre. This is something they'd been talking about since the school year began, always on the phone to each other every week, excitedly talking about the same thing they'd been talking about like 50 times on the phone already. Going through every single last detail of what they were going to do for this mega break. Padre Island is a big old long piece of dirt that sticks out of a big old chunk of Texas. It's a barrier island, and wouldn't you just love it, because it is filled with bars and resorts and good times, chock full of them. This story is set back in 1989, but even now today, over 30 years later, it is still the destination for spring break. In March, it's crazy with the students ready to rock it with their cock out, with their titties out. It's the place to be. So Mark and his friends, they would all meet back up in their hometown of Santa Fe. They would lash into the car, and then they would put the foot down and empty the gas tank. They had a room booked at what was then the Sheraton Hotel in South Padre, and from there on, bros, beers, babes, more beers, more bros, and then more babes. And this wasn't their first time there. They'd partied on Padre twice before, but this time it was kind of special because next year, some of them were moving away. They were moving out of Texas. So in all of their minds, it was kind of like this could be the last time we're all together. The 4 boys are on this trip together. But that was something Mark really needed after focusing so hard on the extremely tough semester. As I said, there was no partying, there was no nothing. So now he needed to really blow off steam. He had just finished 2 really tough exams right before the break. And so Mark and his friends, Brad, Bill, and Brent, that's not confusing at all, they drove all night and arrived at the Sheraton Hotel at 10 a.m. That was on Saturday, the 11th of March, which was about a day or 2 before everything would get completely crazy. And so the partying began, and they went at it hard. The first thing they did was a swimming pool party, which was sponsored by a local beer company. Then they found out that in their hotel, the room directly across from theirs, there's a bunch of college chicks in there. They partied with them, then they went to a Miss Tan Line contest. It rules. They were having like the best time ever. On Saturday, they drove across to Brownsville, a town about half an hour away, to hang there. And on the way, they met a couple of young women from Kansas, asking if they knew how to get to Matamoros, town in Mexico, the twin, essentially, of Brownsville. And Mexico, again, it would also be packed with American students. This whole area was packed, and the students just flocked here. And especially down to Mexico, where, the rules were a little bit looser than they were in America, and the drink was a lot cheaper. So they partied in Matamoros before returning back to Padre Island, trying to sleep off the hangover. Little did any of them know that back in Matamoros, a guy named El Padrino was looking for someone exactly like them. A white spring breaker, a gringo. Not for really any good reason, he was looking for their brains. Quite literally, their brains. They would be offered to El Egua, who's their god, the dark god they were praying to. They would find their victims, and they would force them violently to lie down on an altar, and then they would be flayed, they would be skinned, they would be scalped, they would be dismembered, all while alive, before their hearts would be ripped out. The victims' brains would go to El Padrino, the fingers to his lackeys, and all of them would share in eating the heart. Brains, blood, heart, bones, penis, and balls would be offered to the god, and in return they would receive blessings. It was ancient superstitions, sacrifices, a mixture of religions from Africa, from the Aztecs, and Christianity. It was to remove curses and to destroy their enemies, and they needed an army of souls to do it. That's what they were doing. They were stealing and they were eating souls. And so they now needed a gringo to summon the Great Knight. What better time to get one than at spring break? Brownsville had been getting darker the past number of years as the drugs trade only grew, growing exponentially. Violence had become more and more prevalent, the economy. Matamoros just across the border, the very, very same. But the boys weren't concerned about that. They were partying hard. They were barely sleeping. Like I said, they knew this could be one of their last spring breaks. They didn't want to waste a second of it sleeping. You gotta be going hard every second. On March 13th, it was to Brownsville, but the mood was kind of like meh. They wanted to rage harder, and so they went across the border to Matamoros. That night alone, there was 15,000 American students partying in Matamoros along the main drag alone and in downtown. But on the outskirts of downtown, gunfire was a common occurrence, as was murder and theft. They were going in and out of bars, looking for the parties, which was everywhere. The party was everywhere, looking for girls. And Mark, he was in there like swimwear with a Miss Tanline contestant. But come 2 a.m. that night, Bill, Mark's closest friend out of the entire group, he said, listen, we need to go to bed. We're running on fumes at this point. They were all fairly pissed at this stage, so Bill, Brent, and Brad, they stumbled out of the bar they were in. They started walking along the main drag back towards America. There was a bridge which crossed the border back into America, right? And Mark was right behind him. He was chatting away to Miss Tanline over here. They were only about a block away from the bridge that would take them back into Brownsville, car, home. At one point, Mark was talking to this Miss Tanline contestant. He was talking to her just outside the house. She was crashing in. Bill was just around the corner. He was peeing. While Brad and Brent, they were a distance up ahead, walking away. Mark, he was alone. And Bill just happened at one point to turn towards Mark. And he saw Mark talking to a Mexican fella. He didn't really hear anything he was saying, but he saw him, turned away. And when he looked back, Mark was gone. Mark, he had been shoved into a truck and he'd been driven away. They were driving Mark, as you can imagine, absolutely terrified in the back of this truck. They drove for a couple of blocks. The driver then had to stop off and take a leak. At this point, Mark managed to bust out of the back of the truck and sprint down the road, only for a car that was following the truck to pull over. Guys got out of the car, grabbed Mark, dragged him into the car, and off they went. From there, Mark was dragged into hell. Mark's friends, when they realized he was gone, they searched Matamoros till dawn. Eventually, though, after not finding him for hours, they were like, okay, maybe he made it back to Padre Island. Maybe he's back at the hotel already. Of course, when they got back to the Sheraton Hotel, Brad, Bill, and Brent were even more dismayed to not find him. And so they began thinking, all right, they were starting to panic, but at this point you're like, oh, maybe he hooked up with Miss Tanline. She's going to give him a ride back. He'll turn up, right? Wrong. It was then they went to the South Padre Island Police Department and it reported Mark Kilroy missing. Now, this was taken seriously from the get-go. They generally did take this very seriously, as you would hope and as you would imagine. But kids going missing during spring break, it's not like an uncommon occurrence. The first thing the police did, they went to the Mexican side and they checked the jails there, they checked the hospitals there. He was not there. Things, in fact, went into a higher gear than normal because Mark's father, Jim Kilroy, he had a brother named Ken Kilroy who worked in the U.S. Customs Service Department. So Ken was quickly able to put the word out, let's put a bit of effort behind this, lads. Soon, Mark's parents were down in Brownsville and Matamoros handing out flyers, asking in every establishment if they had seen him, if they knew anything. There was a task force set up specially for Mark, 10 people working full-time on this. And the friends, they were scrutinized hard. Bill, Brent, and Brad. Were you guys doing drugs? Were you banging hoes? No. They were clean as a whistle. The hardest thing they were doing was alcohol. These were not, people who get caught up with the wrong crowd with cartels or any shit like that where you think something might go wrong for Mark. I mean, it did, but they didn't know it. They were simply there drinking, they were flirting, they did not get lucky, I know that game, and that was it. Last time they'd seen Mark, he was speaking to a Mexican guy, end of. There were no leads at all for what happened to Mark. The investigators were giving everything they had to solve this case, but no cracks, no nothing. No matter how much media attention it got, how often Jim and Helen walked the streets with flyers, offering $15,000 for information, it was leading nowhere. One Mexican official, Officer Benitez Ayala, he then took over the case on the Mexican side as they were essentially kind of joining forces, and he began cracking skulls. He was like the top guy looking after this on the Mexican side, and rumors began that it was a group of students from the nearby university. They had been kidnapping children, sacrificing them to Satan, to dark gods, to all this kind of stuff, and they had taken Mark. Or it was, the police already knew exactly where Mark was, but they were too scared to go after him. On the 4th of April, the Kilroys, Mark's parents, they got a call saying, "We have Mark, $10,000 and we will release him, and if you go to the police, we will start sending you his fingers." Now, the callers were two men in the Galveston County Jail, but of course Mark's parents, desperate to find them, giving it their all. They wanted to believe them. Of course, then the police eventually traced the call, found the two men, arrested and charged them. But when the police, when Jim Kilroy would go to the police and say, "What's the latest on you finding my son?" They would say, "We got nothing. No cracks." They would kind of, you're kind of like, maybe you might be shit out of luck. Jim, he'd be like, "Okay, take out the flyers." He would start walking the streets of Matamoros once again. The police began to become worried about his parents' safety, that they might get in trouble, that somebody might kill them. That's how hard they were going at this. Then, on a regular Sunday afternoon, the break in the case came, in kind of a weird way. On April 9th, a man named Serafin Hernandez, nephew of the local crime lord Elio Hernandez, ran a roadblock in Matamoros. Serafin Hernandez and his uncle Elio were big into the drugs business, they were big into the cartels, and they simply, of course, did not give a single shit about any police roadblock. Now, they should have, because this was an international roadblock between Texas and between Mexico, and he just like, vroom, fucking dust in the air. But instead of the police chasing him down, sirens blazing, lights going off, they were like, no, let's see where he goes. Let's follow him. Maybe he'll lead us to bigger fish. He did. He led them to a ranch, Santa Elena, just outside the city of Matamoros. It was there that they organized armed guards, soldiers, and they stormed the place. Arrested was Serafin Hernandez, his uncle Elio, a couple of other gangsters, and a Domingo Bustamante, who was the caretaker of the ranch. A lot of drugs were found on the ranch. Like, a lot of drugs. Cocaine, weed, cell phones, a lot of cars, assault rifles, the kind of things you would imagine you'd find in a cartel bust. But most interestingly, when the caretaker, Domingo, he was shown a picture of Mark Kilroy, asking if he recognized him. Domingo said yes. He said, "Mark Kilroy was here." Domingo said he'd given Mark something to eat. Then Mark was taken into a shack on the ranch. He was never seen again. Inside that shack, the smell of decaying flesh was overwhelming. And they saw this. That's called a nganga. Inside was skulls, bones, various pieces of flesh, brains, and some other items. The floor was covered with blood, candles still lit. Around the room lay machetes, hammers, a large oil drum that had been used to boil people. It was a slaughterhouse. The gang members, they seemed to enjoy the reaction the police had to witnessing this. Police members were getting sick, and the gang members were just laughing. That's when they began digging. The gang members forced to at gunpoint, and on that ranch, 15 mutilated bodies would be found, including Mark Kilroy's. Mark had been buried 3 feet down, and missing from him was his legs, his fingers, his brains, his balls, and his penis. He had been horrifically tortured and then brutally murdered, sacrificed by this cult. The night Mark had been taken in that truck, when he almost escaped and the car that was following him grabbed him, dragged him back, he was taken to that ranch. He was ordered out and he was told to sit on a hammock under a tree. He did so, and he was surrounded by armed gunmen. It's impossible to imagine how terrifying this must have been. He was in that hammock until dawn, when at dawn the caretaker, Domingo Bustamante, he came out and he gave Mark some food. He gave him some milk and some scrambled eggs,
which Mark was starving and he ate. Now Mark would ask the guards though, what's going on? What are you going to do? Is this a ransom? The guards would say nothing's going to happen to you. He was then taken into a shack where the Nganga was kept. He was bound at ropes, duct tape was put over his mouth. He was then brought to their leader, El Padrino. He was tortured and he was sodomized for hours, they said, before El Padrino brought him outside, knelt him down, and with a machete, shot him at the back of the neck. The police were asking, who the hell is this El Padrino and where is he? His name was Adolfo Costanzo, and he was literally the devil. Adolfo de Jesus Costanzo was born on the 1st of November 1962 in Miami to parents who had fled Cuba. Adolfo was obsessed with his appearance from a young age, and he was a good-looking guy, and he knew it. He knew how to turn heads. He also knew how to freak the shit out of people. When he was in school, and if somebody teased him, the next day, outside your house, you would find a severed animal head and blood everywhere. He was like Damien or something from The Omen. You did not mess with little Adolfo, and this was like, he wasn't like a bully. He's not like he's gonna beat you up. He's gonna do some sick shit that will curse you, or something like that. The father would leave the family when Adolfo was quite young, and the mother would take Adolfo to San Juan in Puerto Rico. There, little Adolfo would become an altar boy. But it was weird, right? His mother would remarry to a very successful businessman, though, who was like weirdly afraid of Adolfo. He was like this little creepy kid who was around the house at all times. Him and his mother would go into rooms that, you weren't allowed in, and you just hear these weird chants coming from the room. This guy would eventually die from what was said to be cancer, leaving Adolfo and his mother with a lot of money. They would then move back to Miami, and Adolfo's mother would remarry. This guy was also scared of Adolfo and would beat him. He disappeared. See, Adolfo's mother was a mayomberia, which is like a witch. She practiced black magic, and this was something she passed on to Adolfo. She taught him about magic, occult, voodoo, mixing African magic with that of the Aztecs, and a dollop of Christianity from a young age. As a teen, he began practicing Paulo Mayombe, a religion which developed in Cuba among those of African descent, and it is a mix of all I listed above. It focuses a lot on like spirits of the dead, sacrifices, different deities, and human remains. Like grave robbing is very common. It's viewed within and without as a type of witchcraft. You can cast evil, or you can remove it, do misfortunes on people, that kind of thing. And it's very, very secretive. Reportedly, though, it's very widespread in Cuba, especially among the kids these days. I don't know, it's kind of badass, to be honest. But Adolfo over here, he took that and he took it to the next level. In 1981, Adolfo was back in Miami and he was taking a few classes there. He was arrested a couple of times though for shoplifting, and he later moved to Mexico City. And he had these like weird powers of like attraction. He wasn't exactly like a charming guy, but he could just gather people to him. He was in Mexico City. He was able to get in with the powerful folk, artists, landowners, businessmen, politicians. He just seemed to be able to gather them and almost like bend them to his will. Drug lords too. He dabbled in tarot readings, and he did a lot more than that. He would give you a cleansing ritual, 30 grand a pop, where he would remove the evil, that somebody had cast on you. You would lie down on a bloody altar next to a goat. There would be some weird sexual energy, and your body would be covered with like herbs and oils and that sort of thing. And then animals, both dead and alive, would be passed over you. Blood would be cut. They'd be cut, sacrificed blood drip all over you. And they'd try and put the evil that would be cast on you into an egg. All the while Adolfo was there. He was in robes, muttering strange chants from distant lands. But over time, these rituals would involve less and less animal blood and more human blood. People would be sacrificed instead of goats, and Adolfo's followers would grow and grow, believing he was giving them power. They would lure people in to sacrifice to their dark gods. They would flay people alive, cutting their skin off while they were screaming, scalping them, skinning them. And the point was they had to be alive and in pain for this to work. And after that, while you were alive, they would cut you open and rip your heart out. And they would all share in the blood. It was made as painful as possible for the victim to try and keep the victim alive as long as possible, because they had to get your soul. To quote Cauldron of Blood by Jim Shoots, The soul of the victim must be taught to fear its killer totally and for all time in order to serve the killer loyally and forever. It must be drawn up near the surface of the body, quickened and enlivened, then broken and subjugated totally. Brains would be removed, fingers and blood drained into an inganga, the cauldron. The parts put in it, the blood put in it, and the blood boiled, essentially trying to make it like a stew, a human stew. Then it was devoured. Except the heart. The heart wasn't put in it. It was important for the heart to be eaten while it was still warm. From 1987 to 1989, Mexican City Police found 8 disfigured corpses at the bottom of a lagoon, tied to cement blocks. All were Adolfo's, and a hell of a lot more would be found. Adolfo was often joined by his lover, Sara Aldrete. Sara was a young woman born in Matamoros, Mexico, but in 1985 she moved across from Matamoros to Brownsville, getting a visa and attending Texas Southmost College. She was doing work studies, so she worked for the college in lieu of paying tuition, and she was studying physical education. In, the college, she blossomed. She was head of the booster club for the soccer team that was really popular. She was beloved by students. She was beloved by faculty. For a time, she was dating a guy named Serafin Hernandez, who you might remember who I mentioned before. He was studying in the college at the same time Sara was. He was studying law enforcement, if you can believe that. As you can probably also imagine, he wasn't studying it because he wanted to be a cop. His family was in the drugs business. He was studying it so he could become a better drug smuggler, doing it to help the fam, especially his powerful uncle Elio Hernandez. This was a cartel that smuggled major amounts of cocaine, cane, and weed. But Sara would later leave him when she went to a tarot card reading by this strange guy from Cuba. She was inexplicably attracted to him. Now, never once in this Texas college did she ever seem interested, displayed any interest in the occult or anything like that, but behind closed doors. On the surface, Sara, sweet, innocent kids, everybody's favorite, popular. But, back when she was back in across the border in Matamoros with Adolfo, she was his priestess. The staff at the college had no clue about this, but the students became more and more aware. She would give these weird-ass speeches about the occult and how she was this high priestess and explaining dark magic to all of these people, like super, super serious. And Adolfo was using her to get to the Hernandez family. As I said, she used to date Serafin, nephew of the drug cartel lord. First, he would use Sara to get Serafin to join what would become known as the Matamoros cult. Then to Elio. Adolfo got Sara to sleep with Elio so he could get closer to him. And soon Adolfo had this entire drug smuggling family under his control too. Elio Hernandez, the don of the family, would become a priest for Adolfo too. Soon Adolfo was demanding half the profits of this drug smuggling business, and who could resist it? And Adolfo and Sara were very important to this Matamoros drug cartel. After all, Adolfo held their very souls in his hands. At times, they would dress in black robes around a bloody altar while Adolfo stood in the center wearing a white robe, and young men would be forced to lie down on this altar, often violently forced to lie down on this altar, and Adolfo would chant, and he would do signs, and the spirits would take over him. Then duct tape would be put over the victim's mouth, blades would come out, as would the inganga. Adolfo would teach Elio this, who became very adept, very, very quickly, at cutting off the victim's legs, fingers, penis, while they were still alive, and then cutting open their chest and ripping their heart out. So now you know the inspirations for all those Mexican beheading videos. And Elio and Serafin would be arrested at the ranch where a lot of this was done, and they would tell all of this to the police. They began to talk, and you kind of gotta wonder why they were so involved in this cult and this church. Why did they talk? Well, it's kind of funny. The Mexican police had a really good technique for making you talk. They got carbonated water, bottle of carbonated water. They shook it up real good. And then they opened it really quickly and shoved it up your nose. The carbonated water would explode into your skull. It was extremely painful and it left no visible signs of torture. You do it a few times, people will say whatever you want. It made people shit themselves. It was so painful. If you did it a couple of times in a couple of minutes, you would be a quivering piece of jelly on the floor. But where was Adolfo? At the time the scene on the ranch was discovered, Adolfo and Sarah were actually in Miami, and they were on their way back to Matamoros. Little did they know they were soon becoming the subject of international attention and a manhunt. News from all over the world was covering the story. It was insane. Like a satanic cult literally chopping people up and torturing them to death, praying to gods, this kind of shit. It sounds like something out of a shitty horror movie, but this was real and it was terrifying. And this was in the late 80s when the satanic panic was like... So before they heard the news that the scene had been discovered, they were already back to the ranch. They got into Brownsville and they stayed in Brownsville at a Holiday Inn. And then it was the next morning Sarah put on the TV and saw the news.
Authorities say that Mark Kilroy was grabbed somewhere near here by satanic cult members who motioned him towards their car. Signed confessions from some of the suspects reveal that at one point Mark was able to escape into the streets of this town, but that he was recaptured and taken to the Santa Elena Ranch. 25 miles into Mexico, the shallow graves of a dozen found, 2 still buried, tell the story of a drug-dealing cult led by a Cuban godfather. Inside a small shack, ritualistic candles and reminders of torture. Outside, a cauldron that authorities say was filled with human brain matter, blood, and animal parts.
I cannot understand how somebody can just tell somebody else pick him up and go kill him. I have a hard time personally recognize that fact. I can't believe it can be done.
Authorities believe Mark and the others were victims of a group that transported some 1,000 pounds of marijuana into Texas each week, that the Cuban padrino or godfather was possibly linked to a form of voodoo, Santeria, practiced in the Caribbean. The men, seemingly without remorse, all talked about a cult that killed to please its godfather, that abducted Kilroy because the godfather wanted an Anglo, part of the spring break crowd.
Sarah, she raced home to her parents' house. She grabbed what clothes she could. She tried to remove what evidence she could. She went back to the Holiday Inn in Brownsville, and then her and Adolfo, they went to McAllen, and they flew from McAllen to Mexico City. There in Mexico City, they hid with their followers while this international manhunt was going, and they were moving around to these various safe houses in Mexico City. And people would see Adolfo, El Diablo, all over. He was seen in Chicago trying to steal children. He was seen in New Mexico filling up gas. Real like boogeyman type shit. People were seeing them. Ooh, he's behind you. There were a number of raids in Mexico City trying to find him, and they found stuff, just not him. They found bloody altars, a lot of gay porn. Okay. They would find blood, they would find bones, whether these were from older rituals or if he was keeping this up while still on the run, who knows. But in May of 1989, so about a month after the scene was discovered, a known accomplice of Adolfo's was seen in a supermarket in Mexico City. And so they followed him. It was believed he was buying stuff for Adolfo. Correct. Adolfo was living in a shitty little apartment with his accomplices at the time. It was actually in quite a nice neighborhood though. But Adolfo and Sarah, they knew the net was closing and they would not be taken alive. They had drugs and they had guns and they were gonna go out with a party. And soon their apartment was surrounded by police. Adolfo, he was paranoid. He was not the same guy he had been. Not the same guy who had gained control of an entire drugs cartel. They started shooting at the police outside. Adolfo, a gunfight began between the cultists and the police, and Adolfo was screaming chants and rituals the entire time. He put his money on the stovetop, setting fire to his own money, saying they were not going to get it. He then walked over to one of his henchmen, El Dubi, and he told El Dubi to shoot him and to kill him.